I like to let them, you know, make them so they'll last a long time. This is a special edition, COVID edition uh, of this video for you guys. It's a special year. The last major topic we didn't get to for the 19th century is imperialism. Okay, so I want to talk about that before you try to answer this DBQ, this new 2020 style DBQ. So, quick definition, real simple. The definition of imperialism is still argued about today, so there's not one clear definition, but for our purposes, we're talking about the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the economic, political, and social life of the people of that nation. And it can be all or just one of those things. Okay, imperialism takes different forms. Some colonies are taken over just for economic gain. Some are purely political. And actually cost the host country money. And sometimes, to a greater or lesser extent, the Europeans and Americans try to impose their social mores and morality on top of the native people. So it doesn't have to be all three. It can be, but it can be any combination of those. So why are Western powers doing this? If you look at a map of Africa, and I have a really cool one back in the classroom, Africa in 1815, Europeans only had a few tiny outposts along the coast at the mouth of the Congo, at the mouth of the Nile, at the tip of South Africa. But the great majority of Africa had not been explored or conquered or subjugated by Western powers. Okay, so what changes? What changes between the time of the Congress of Vienna and the end of the 19th century? All right. Well, we get the first and second industrial revolutions. We'll talk more in another lecture I'm going to post later this week about the second industrial revolution. But essentially, factories and industrial processes, they need a great deal of resources and raw materials in order to produce things. So those resources will come to some extent from colonies. Colonies in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. Now, Latin America has already been largely colonized, and by 1821 will be largely independent. So we're going to focus on Africa and Asia, okay, because they're the ones whose status really changes throughout the 19th century. So, European nations are competing economically, and essentially we've got to talk about European nations, sort of the new version of the great powers, because what happened in 1871? Germany became a nation/empire. Okay, that upset the balance of power set up at the Congress of Vienna permanently, or at least until 1991. So these nations are competing with each other, and one way they're competing is economically. Okay, so they need markets to sell their goods, so they want to increase territories that they control or influence overseas, so they can sell more of their goods to do better economically than their rivals. So think of your great powers. We've got Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and now kind of peeking in, we have the other new country of Italy. Okay, and all these nations want to make a name for themselves as colonial powers. Okay. Who's the best, right? One of the main isms of the 19th century is nationalism, and that takes two forms, right? We have nationalism like we had German nationalism and Italian nationalism in 1848, where you say, we are one people, one language, one culture, we want one nation. But then once you have a nation, nationalism takes the form of, we are better than other nations. Britain is better than France. Germany is better than Italy. Basically, you want to measure your greatness against your neighbors. And so the number of colonies that you have and the size of your empire is one way to keep score. Right? And then the growing racism, pardon me, racism that term's thrown around a lot these days. Okay, sometimes people say racist when they mean bigotry or prejudice or intolerance, but technical classical racism is that you believe the determining factor of human civilization is the race of the people. Okay, there's all sorts of what we call pseudoscience now, back then, that look at essentially what are the different characteristics between the races, and the Europeans essentially come up with a theory that the superior, the best race to have been established is the white European race, and that other races were inferior. Now, sometimes racism takes the form of, hey, it's not their fault, let's help them out. Other times it takes a more oppressive form. But essentially, if you're a racist in the 19th century sense, you believe that race is the determining factor of both the individual and the society. Okay. And it's also, how did they come to this conclusion? Well, they measured themselves, and they measured themselves on things that they were already good at. Okay, they said if you look at technology, if you look at government institutions, if you look at scientific accomplishments, the Western Europeans and the Americans say, well, we're ahead of everybody, so something's making our society greater. Some people today, conservatives, would argue that it was freedom, but 19th century racists say, no, it's white folks have it more together. And so they can either, then it takes two forms. They can either exploit the other peoples of the world, or it's their duty to help these less fortunate, darker people. Okay, so that's 19th century racism, which fuels a lot of it. Okay. Underpinning this, remember I talked about pseudoscience, is people taking the work of Charles Darwin and applying it to civilizations. Okay, so another big thing in 1848, Darwin's main work comes out, right? The Origin of Species. And in that, a lot of people talk about evolution. If we were in class, I would say, what did Darwin come up with? And I would call on a few of you and you'd say evolution. And I would say, no. What Darwin came up with is natural selection. That's the engine that runs evolution, okay? He said, yeah, there's evolution, and here's how it happens. So essentially, think of it this way. Simply put, the giraffes don't grow long necks to get to the higher food and calories that they need, right? Over generations, over a long period of time, the longer necked giraffes had an advantage over the shorter necked giraffes that allowed them to live longer and reproduce more. That's how natural selection works, okay? And Darwin described that, okay? So the giraffes, they didn't stretch out and grow their necks, okay? And it also wasn't like the social Darwinists feel, and that it's survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest meant that the long-necked giraffes were fitter for their environment than other creatures. It didn't mean there was an all-out war between long-neck and short-necked giraffes. Social Darwinism says struggle is part of nature, and the fittest will survive this struggle. Okay, so you can guess what kind of people are going to dig social Darwinism, that life is based on struggle, and that human society is advanced by one group winning and another group losing. And so social Darwinism underpins this idea that goes along with racism to say it's our job to perfect and pursue the best civilization we can, and to either bring other races along with us or to end them. Okay, so Europeans feel that they have the right and the duty to bring all of their great progress to the other peoples of the world. Okay, so I talked a little bit about that, sort of the two faces of racism. And then we get another group who are really sure that the people of Africa and Asia, if they die without hearing about this guy Jesus and his mission to earth and the saving power of his death and resurrection, that they're going to go to hell. And so a large group of people feel, look, we must convert these heathens, okay, was the term they used, to Christianity. They need to know how to get to heaven, and so we're going to go out and we're going to let them know about Jesus. Okay, so the need to Christianize the African people. Christianizing in a broader sense, a lot of Europeans want to westernize or civilize people of these other continents. We want to make them aspire to have what we have: indoor plumbing, lots of consumer goods, advanced medical care. The people of Europe and America feel a need to bring this to others. Okay, so there are darker motives and more humanistic motives, but all of them cause difficulties, dislocations, etc. in the nations in which they are inflicted. So why were they able to do this? You remember I talked a couple seconds ago about Now, in 1815, if you looked at a map of Africa, there's just tiny little European settlements in some coastal areas, right? Some ports or some areas where rivers empty into the ocean. And the great interior wasn't explored. I mean, this was a time where maps had question marks on them. Okay, we know every single square inch of the Earth's surface now, but back then we didn't, and there's big question marks all over the center of Africa. So, what enables people to go there? All right. Well, we talked a little bit about technological superiority. We'll talk more. Well, we would have talked more if we ever got to World War I about the machine gun. But an American who invented the light bulb, named Hiram Maxim, he didn't get rich on the light bulb because Thomas Edison invented it before he did. And so he makes a machine that lets Europeans kill each other faster called the Maxim gun. Okay, this is the first truly fully automatic weapon. And with it, basically, suffice it to say, a small number of men can greatly outgun a larger number of men. So Europeans would send detachments with Maxim guns once they had gone into a territory to dissuade the local people from trying to take it back. Another technological improvement that allows them to get away from the river mouth and way into the interior of Africa is they take James Watt's steam engine and a guy named Matthew Bolton. No, that's the secretary to the UN. Robert Fulton. They put his engine on a boat, and now you can go as far as you want upstream against the current. Okay, before the steamboat, you had to paddle anywhere you wanted to go, so it was daunting to paddle thousands of miles into the interior of Africa. So Europeans are getting there with steamboats and machine guns, and they have steamships to get from Europe to Africa more quickly and in larger numbers. All right. Eventually, the Europeans will improve transportation within these colonies. They'll build railroads in India and China and all throughout Africa, and essentially build an infrastructure there to meet their own economic needs. But they're still useful to the people who live there today, some of them. All right. Why else? Well, the biggest enemy of the European in Africa is disease. Okay, and the deadliest disease is malaria. All right, and you're hearing a lot in the news today about anti-malarial drugs trying to treat COVID, so far with limited success. But quinine, which is a very bitter compound, if you've ever had tonic water, hopefully without gin, you can taste that bitterness. But if you ingest quinine, it basically shuts down the malaria virus, and you don't get deadly symptoms from malaria. So protected from malaria and with advanced weapons and transportation, within 50 years, Europeans are going to conquer almost all of Africa and big, huge chunks of Asia. All right. And also, the locals can be exploited. They had previously had, in central sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa, clan-based politics and societies. There was a lot of rivalry between ethnic groups, and so Europeans could often play one group against another, and the Africans didn't really have the political tools or social tools to unite as one single group. And so the Europeans were able to simply divide them up, bring aboard those who weren't going to resist, and focus their military efforts on groups that would resist. And so the lack of a unified African response allowed this small number of Europeans to conquer this whole continent. So by 1914, right, by World War I, if you look, all of Africa, with two exceptions, this place and this place, have been conquered by outside powers. This place right here is Liberia, which was founded, you'll learn in U.S. history next year when school's back on, as a colony for former slaves if they wanted to return to Africa. It was an experiment with mixed results. So that's protected by the U.S., so the Europeans leave that alone. And over here, this is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is the only nation, the only African nation, to defeat a European aggressor militarily to maintain its independence. And the nation it defeated, Italy. If we were going to continue with school this year, I would then remind you of that when we got to Mussolini and Italy and Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. But for our purposes today, except for those two places, all of Africa and large chunks of Asia, okay, are empires of the Europeans. And China, we don't have too much time to talk about China today, but essentially it's not officially part of anyone's colony, but it's carved up into spheres of influence because the dynastic government in China is very weak. And so the Europeans and the Americans carve out little areas for themselves so they don't have to compete with each other to exploit Chinese resources. All right. So, how would this work? Well, the Europeans are afraid of, and I love this standard clip art for a reason I'll get to in a minute. European nations are afraid that they could get into a war with each other over fighting over spoils of Africa. Okay, so they have a conference to sit down and lay out the ground rules for conquering this continent and subjugating these people. And the clip art is not accurate because nobody this color or this color was invited. It was all people these colors. Okay, it was all Europeans at the conference. No Africans were invited. And the European heads of state simply sat down and made rules of the game, sort of like if you agree before you play Monopoly or Risk or something on the house rules. Okay, so any European nation essentially can claim they control a land, but they have to demonstrate that they can do it. If you claim that you control Tanzania, you have to demonstrate that you can maintain peace there, keep it from invading its neighbors, keep revolutions from happening, etc. Okay, so you can't just claim something in name only. You have to be able to administer the territory. All right, and when drawing up lines of who controlled what, we get this unfortunate reality which plagues us after World War I as well, in that people drawing lines on maps ignore different groups of people, split up linguistic groups, split up tribal and clan groups, and put traditional enemies together in small spaces, and that's going to play itself out all the way up to, in the 1990s, the Hutu and the Tutsis and the genocide there. Hotel Rwanda is your movie reference there. So that's the Berlin Conference. It also addresses some Serbian, Balkan issues, but we're not going to get to that because we don't have to actually get into World War I. But the Berlin Conference is important, not as important as Congress of Vienna, but it really sets the stage for the next 30 years or so. All right. So what's the impact? There are positive impacts. Okay. Local warfare was reduced. Sanitation is improved. All right. Networks of hospitals. Essentially, the overall lifespan will increase among African people. Quality of life, we can debate. How do you measure that? That's very controversial to this day. But indigenous peoples have improved access to sanitation, hospitals, education. One of the key steps, we talked about this in the Reformation, in order for these Christian missionaries to get these people to learn about Jesus Christ, they need to teach them how to read. And so we get expanded literacy, all right? And ultimately, there is going to be economic growth. It's just going to benefit the colonial powers much more than the local powers. Okay, so there are positive impacts. The negative impacts list, guess what? It's a little bit longer. Okay, so their land is co-opted, as is their independence. Essentially, and this is very different across Africa, but it's not great anywhere. They're able to force the Africans there to work for them. The most infamous example is in the Belgian Congo, which if you ever read Heart of Darkness, fantastic book, they're able to go in there and impose laws on the Africans and then arrest the Africans for breaking these laws that the Africans didn't make or know about, and then they're forced to work as their punishment for breaking these new laws that the Europeans brought in. And those people that you can force to work simply by setting up a legal structure around them, they don't have a lot of value to the person economically. Remember, with slaves at least, slaves were expensive and were considered an asset by the slave owner. The Belgians in the Congo and powers in other places, they enslaved people, but the people had no intrinsic value. So thousands and thousands and continent-wide millions are worked to death because these populations are captive and these laborers can be replaced. So that is very different throughout Africa, but most times the native workers are paid much, much less, if at all, and they work in brutal conditions. And so it's still to this day, Africa is economically dealing with the legacy of both imperialism and the Cold War, which again we can't get to this year. I'm sorry. Um, and then basically, and again, this is to varying extents depending on who was the controlling power. The Europeans will come in and say, your culture hasn't really done you much benefit. Your way of doing things, your religion, your customs, those have led you to be conquered by us. So the best thing you can take out of this experience is to be like us. And maybe someday in future generations, you'll conquer somebody. And so European culture is placed on top of African culture. And then again, to a greater or lesser extent, African peoples are forced to abandon their culture or continue it in secret. In some places, African culture lives alongside European culture, but essentially there are a lot of identity problems that are going to come in Europe and in the time of decolonialization in the 1950s and 60s. And then essentially, we talked about this already, Africa's divided into artificial boundaries, these artificial countries. A lot of that is why there is warfare in Africa to this day. I mean, we had Sudan and South Sudan created a few years ago to try and separate two populations that had been at war with each other for a long time because they were forced together by these external boundaries. So a lot of positive, a lot of negative. We'd go into this in much more detail if school was still on, but I'm going to stop it there as kind of an intro. Now go look at the practice DBQ, which is up under this video. And before you do the DBQ questionnaire if you want. You don't have to, but if you don't know how to get started, fill out the DBQ questionnaire, and then you'll have a roadmap for writing the DBQ. All right? Miss you guys, and enjoy this poorly made but unique video.